Today is Friday, 27th September. I'm still, as you can see, in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia in my hotel room. I anticipate returning to London on Sunday. That might be a long trip again, and well, we'll see whether I'm going to be able to make videos that day, though I will definitely try. But in the meantime, let's return to the topics that are in the news as I make this program. Firstly, the conflict in the Middle East continues. There continue to be missile and bombing strikes on each side by Israel and Hezbollah. Israel, for its part, Prime Minister Netanyahu, to be more precise, has issued what The Guardian elliptically says are contradictory statements about the French-American proposal for a 21-day ceasefire. In fact, it's quite clear to me that he has rejected those proposals. And at one and the same time that the United States continues to wring its hands, or at least the administration does, and claim that it wants a ceasefire and spreads stories about the difficult relationship between itself and Prime Minister Netanyahu and his government, the United States continues to supply Israel with arms and equipment and intelligence and continues to move troops and equipment to the region, supposedly to deter Iran from attacking Israel. And at the same time as all that is going on, the Iranians, for their part, continue to try to conduct their own very difficult balancing act. President Pezeshkian continues to move around the United Nations, insisting to everybody that Iran wishes to be a force for stability, that it does not require an all-out war, even as Iranian officials continue to give reassurances to Hezbollah and Iran's other Shia allies across the Middle East that Iran won't abandon them. So the situation plays out exactly as it has done for the last couple of days. There is still no sign of an Israeli ground operation in southern Lebanon. Perhaps that will come. My own view is that Prime Minister Netanyahu and his government will be reluctant to start a ground operation, which would result in Israeli troops fighting Hezbollah fighters on the ground, where Hezbollah has its defenses and its fortifications and its tunnels and all that kind of thing, given that that is precisely the kind of war that I suspect Hezbollah would want to fight against the Israeli army. Whilst the fighting remains as it is, with bombing and missile strikes, the advantage remains in Israel's favor unless and until we reach a situation where, as has been claimed by all sorts of people, where Israel's own air defense capabilities have been depleted to the point that Hezbollah missiles and rockets start to get through. And then, but not before, I think discussions about a possible ceasefire might start in earnest, always assuming, of course, that Israel doesn't, or rather the Israeli government doesn't decide to escalate further. And on that further point, I ought to say that, of course, Hezbollah's own ability to continue to send missiles and rockets against Israel depends on whether it can continue to launch these missiles and rockets. Presumably, the Israelis are targeting the launch sites. I'm not sure. I don't think anybody really knows how successful in that the Israelis have been. And of course, always there is the question of what will happen in Iran, whether the tug of war that is playing out there will be won by the moderates, if I can call them that, led by President Pezeshkian, who I sense is starting to lose ground, or whether ultimately the hardliners will decide that Iran can't afford to see its regional alliances collapse and will start to take further steps. Anyway, that's where we are with the situation in the Middle East. The conflict situation continues to be extremely difficult. Prime Minister Netanyahu, over the last couple of weeks, has seen support for him in Israel recover. He has managed to regain the support of his electoral base. He seems to me to be as strongly in control of Israel as ever. He's taking advantage of the political vacuum which exists in Washington, and he's playing his cards with typical ruthlessness and skill. And I think people underestimate the skill, just as I think that they have consistently underestimated Prime Minister Netanyahu. And let me repeat again a point I have made several times. I think the assessment that many make, that he acts exclusively out of opportunistic and cynical motives, is wrong. Anyway, let me now turn to that other topic, the topic that is perhaps more pressing, which is the topic of the conflict in Ukraine. I say more pressing because I think the major conflict in the Middle East is still to come, though I am confident that it will eventually do so. The more pressing conflict, the one in Ukraine, I think is now in its closing stretch. But anyway, let's look at the situation that is playing out in Ukraine at the moment. Well, the first thing to say is that yesterday, President Zelensky, and by the way, in response to some comments, I will continue to refer to President Zelensky as President Zelensky. I appreciate that there is a major, massive question mark over the legitimacy of his position as president. But the fact is, the world continues to recognize him as Ukraine's president, and there is no significant political challenge to him in Ukraine at the moment. He continues to be referred to in Ukraine as President Zelensky, and until somebody does take steps to remove him from his office, I think for the moment at least, I'm going to continue to call him President Zelensky. He continues to be the person who, as eccentrically as ever perhaps, remains in charge. So anyway, President Zelensky yesterday had his meetings first with President Biden of the United States and then with Vice President Kamala Harris, who is, of course, the Democratic Party's challenger, the nominee in the forthcoming presidential election in the United States. Now, this was a most extraordinary, very unusual meeting in the sense that for the previous weeks, there'd been a massive amount of talk about this meeting between President Zelensky and President Biden. We were told that President Zelensky would present his victory plan to President Biden. This is going to be a sort of big make or break moment. He would be looking for the United States to make a public commitment, not just to Ukraine's victory, but to provide the means for that victory. That would include, according to the victory plan, as we now basically know, a commitment for Ukraine to enter NATO before the end of this year, a commitment, or at least an agreement, that missile strikes could take place inside Russia. We're expecting all of this, discussions about all of this. This is going to be, as I said, a major meeting, and it was all built up into a huge moment. And then the meeting came and went, and the media, both in the United States and in Europe, has largely ignored it. And I find that really remarkable. But anyway, there it is. Now, we have had from the White House a readout which gives us ideas of what happened over the course of this meeting. And in particular, there's been a readout from the White House of the meeting with President Biden. And I'm going to read it out. It says, President Biden met today with President Zelensky of Ukraine at the White House to discuss US support for Ukraine in its defense against Russian aggression. President Biden outlined his decision to surge US security assistance to Ukraine, and President Zelensky presented his plan to achieve victory over Russia. The two leaders discussed the diplomatic, economic, and military aspects of President Zelensky's plan and tasked their teams to engage in intensive consultations regarding the next steps. On October 12th, 2024, President Biden will host a leader-level meeting of the Ukraine Defense Contact Group in Germany, where the two leaders will review progress on these consultations and coordinate with international partners on additional assistance for Ukraine. President Biden is determined to provide Ukraine with the support it needs to win. Now, notice those last words. President Biden is determined to provide Ukraine with the support it needs to win. Now, those words actually go significantly further than anything that the United States, or at least the administration, has been saying up to now. Up to now, the policy has not been, the stated policy has not been about helping Ukraine to win some war against Russia. It has been to put Ukraine in a strong negotiating position so that diplomatic negotiations can take place between the Russians and the Ukrainians, in which the Ukrainians supposedly will have the advantage. Now, in this readout, President Biden is supposedly talking about the United States, or at least he himself, and it's important to say that it is in fact he himself, is now talking about helping Ukraine to win, being determined to make sure that Ukraine actually wins. Now, he, of course, is the outgoing president, and the person he presumably wants to succeed him, who is Vice President Kamala Harris, appears to have been a lot more reticent in what she had to say. So now we have also a readout from Zelensky's visit, President Zelensky's meeting with Vice President Harris. And it reads as follows. Vice President Kamala Harris met today with President Zelensky of Ukraine at the White House. The Vice President expressed her unwavering commitment to stand with Ukraine. They discussed the importance of continued strong US support for Ukraine in its defense against Russian aggression. President Zelensky's plans for victory and efforts to secure a just and lasting peace based on the will of the people of Ukraine and the UN Charter. Notice no reference here to Vice President Harris being committed to a Ukrainian victory, a Ukrainian win. Instead, this speaks about a just and lasting peace based on the will of the people of Ukraine and the UN Charter. And then the rest of the readout reads, the two leaders also discussed the latest developments on the battlefield and ongoing US military assistance to Ukraine, including President Biden's major announcements today. Building on previous discussions, The Vice President welcomed continued progress by Ukraine on rule of law reforms and anti-corruption efforts, and they discussed continued US support for bolstering Ukraine's civilian energy infrastructure after renewed attacks from Russia. There is a significant difference in tone between these two readouts. Biden, full of support for Ukraine, wants Ukraine to win. Harris talks about listening to what Zelensky has to say, taking note of the military situation, wanting a just and lasting peace based on the will of the people of Ukraine, which of course begs the question of which people. Does that include the people of eastern Ukraine, for example, and also the principles set out in the UN Charter? And Vice President Harris talking about the need for Ukraine to continue to conduct anti-corruption reforms and all those sort of things, something which is strikingly absent from President Biden's, from the readout of Zelensky's meeting with President Biden. Maybe I am reading too much into these two readouts. Maybe these were two complementary meetings. Biden perhaps playing soft cop a little to Harris's hard cop. Maybe that's all it was. But I have to say there is a coolness in the Harris readout, which you don't really see in the Biden readout. But ultimately, let's strip that all away and ask ourselves this fundamental question. What does Biden, on behalf of the United States, actually, in practical terms, commit the United States to? Well, Biden has surged aid to Ukraine. Now, this is the remaining funds allocated by Congress in the $61 billion appropriation that Congress voted through in April. There's apparently around $8 billion left. I've actually seen lower figures, some say $5.5 billion, others say $6 billion, but I'm going to go for the moment with the figure of $8 billion. And the President Biden, is going to search that. All of it is going to be provided to Ukraine over the course of the next few months, whilst Biden himself is in office. So Zelensky is going to leave the United States with a definite commitment that he's going to get all of this money, and it's all going to come whilst Biden is still president. Now, that in itself, well, it is no doubt helpful to Zelensky. He's coming back with rather a lot of money, but it actually carries, if you like, a hidden message which the Ukrainians might not altogether like, because it sort of suggests that one reason why Biden is surging all this money to Ukraine at this particular point in time is because Biden is not confident that whoever succeeds him as president is going to continue to provide funding to Ukraine at the same level as before. And of course, if the next president is Donald Trump, well, it's possible that Donald Trump might make a decision that any further funds left over from the appropriation shouldn't be sent to Ukraine at all. In other words, that Ukraine might end up receiving significantly less than this $8 billion left over from the $61 billion appropriation. Given, as I said, the coolness of the Harris readout, I wonder whether Biden and his team might feel that perhaps even Vice President Harris, for all her talk about her staunch support for Ukraine, might be less keen on continuing to provide Ukraine assistance, assuming, of course, that she is elected. So Zelensky's going to get his $8 billion. As I said, this isn't entirely a good signal for him. It might suggest that it's the last $8 billion that the United States is going to provide. Terms upon which it is being given might suggest that. But of course, what else did he come away with? Well, the readout of the Biden-Zelensky meeting doesn't refer to any decisions about any of the things that are said to be set out in Zelensky's victory plan. There is no commitment there to Ukraine being given a date for NATO entry, which could be effective before the end of this year. There is no reference here to a decision to conduct missile strikes deep inside Russia. Instead, what we're told is that there's going to be yet another meeting on the 12th of October, which both Biden and Zelensky are going to attend. Presumably it will be in Washington, or maybe it will be a virtual meeting. And there, further decisions will be made with all the various NATO allies present. Now, there is, I think, in effect, no prospect that some of the NATO allies, Germany, Italy, and France, will agree to Ukraine joining NATO on the kind of accelerated timescale that Zelensky is demanding. And the Germans have already made clear their strong opposition to deep strikes against Russia. And it seems to me that Italy certainly will reject that proposal also, based on the statements that the Meloni government has been making. And frankly, I think that France will have difficulty agreeing to that as well. I think that even if President Macron is keen on that idea, which he might be, his new Prime Minister, Michel Barnier, almost certainly will not be. And there is a real risk that if the French government were to propose something like that, the French Parliament would rebel and there could be a government crisis in Paris, which at the present time, I don't think President Macron wants. So I think this proposal is unlikely to move forward either at this meeting on the 12th of October. Maybe again, I am misjudging this, but it seems to me that what Biden is doing is he's telling Zelensky, yes, of course, we want you to win. We are fully behind you. We are 100% behind you. No, actually, we're 150% behind you. We're going to give you all the money you want. We're going to give you more weapons. But, these rather controversial proposals that you're making for accelerated NATO entry and for deep strikes against Russia, well, we can't go along with that all by ourselves. We need to get our allies to agree. And of course, all that is being said in the confident and certain knowledge that the allies, Germany, Italy, France, will not agree. So it's a way of saying no to Zelensky without appearing to do so. It's a way of kicking the can down the road, or if you like, passing responsibility to someone else, in this case to the major European powers. That's how it looks to me. If the administration really wanted to see these things happen. They would have confirmed the US's support for them. The readout would say that the United States welcomes, for example, Ukraine's wish to enter NATO as soon as possible and will take all steps that it can to ensure that it happens. And that, of course, would put huge pressure on the Europeans to agree. But by refusing to make any such public commitment, the Americans, as I said, are basically kicking this idea into the long grass. That is how it seems to me. Now, of course, we'll have to wait and see what happens on the 12th of October. But this looks to me, as I said, like an elegant way of saying no without perhaps bringing on the embarrassment of actually publicly doing so. Now, there has been an article in the London Times which straightforwardly says that a decision has been made by the United States that they will not basically agree to missile strikes deep into Ukraine, into Russia. And there's also been another article in the New York Times which says that the US intelligence community has advised the president that authorizing missile strikes inside Russia would not change the situation on the battlefronts, but it would provoke the Russians into counter steps, some of which might be drastic and very dangerous, and that for that reason, this proposal should be avoided. This idea should be avoided. And there are other reports which I read perhaps in less authoritative media places, in independent media, if you like, that there's actually been a meeting. There was a meeting some time ago between President Biden and US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, in which Lloyd Austin basically told Biden, or straightforwardly told Biden, that the Pentagon adamantly opposes this idea. They cannot see that it confers any benefits whatsoever upon Ukraine, whilst also involving the United States in unacceptable risks given the possible likely Russian reaction. Now, all that is true, and as I said, we've had articles in the London Times and the New York Times which effectively hint at this, or the London Times article says this, the New York Times article says that the intelligence community is taking this line, then I think that this idea of missile strikes deep inside Russia has been, at least at the moment, abandoned. Perhaps after the election, if we get a new president and that president decides to take a hardline course against the Russians, maybe in an effort to bring the conflict in Ukraine to an end, maybe this idea will be revived, but the Pentagon is opposed to it, the intelligence community is opposed to it. Frankly, I don't think it's going to happen. And without exactly saying no, I get the sense that that is basically what President Biden was telling Zelensky over the course of their meeting. So, in terms of his victory plan, President Zelensky has not got the commitments that he was supposedly looking for. So that's the first thing to say about these meetings with Biden and Harris. Now, all these meetings have been overshadowed by the drama of President Zelensky's arguments with the Republicans. And this extends to all sorts of things. A deeply misjudged visit apparently to Pennsylvania arguments from the Republicans that President Zelensky and his government appear to be favoring the Democrats and are, as a result, interfering in the US election. All of this, according to the Financial Times, has led to bitter recriminations in Kiev itself, within President Zelensky's government. Many people have been saying there, apparently, that this thing has been very seriously mismanaged by the Ukrainian embassy in Washington, mirroring maybe what Speaker Johnson said in his letter to Zelensky. Anyway, the Ukrainians, Zelensky himself, understand that there is a possibility that Donald Trump will be the next president of the United States. They also understand that further support from the United States might not be forthcoming if even Republican allies like Lindsey Graham are alienated. So Zelensky and the Ukrainians, and I suspect others in the United States also, have moved heaven and earth to try to sort out this quarrel with the Republicans and with Donald Trump. And Zelensky himself wrote a letter, not exactly apologizing to Donald Trump, but begging Donald Trump to reconsider his refusal to meet with Zelensky. Anyway, this letter was sent. Donald Trump predictably published it. But the long and the short of it is that Trump and Zelensky are indeed going to meet, apparently, in Trump's office, in Trump Tower, in New York. Now, I don't think that President Trump is going to make any commitments, long-term commitments, to Zelensky. And as far as the Democrats are concerned, I think this has been an unfortunate affair. It has meant that it has made it appear that it is actually Donald Trump who is making the weather on the question of aid, US aid for Ukraine, which is hardly the look that Vice President Harris and her team are promoting at this particular point in time. Though I must say straight away that I doubt that most American voters are paying very much attention to all of these maneuvers. But anyway, what does President Zelensky get from all of this? Well, I think he gets actually a certain amount. He's met President Biden. He's got President Biden to tell him that President Biden wants Ukraine to win. He's had a meeting with Vice President Harris. She has said that she's listened to Zelensky's victory plan, and she's spoken of her staunch support for the defense of Ukraine. And Zelensky's also going to meet Donald Trump. And, well, we don't quite know what's going to come out of that meeting, but he has spoken with the three most important people in the United States at this time: the president, the vice president, who might become president, and the Republican challenger, who might become president again. And moreover, he's coming back to Kiev with $8 billion, or at least a commitment for $8 billion in aid, economic and financial aid, aid for the energy system and all that, as well as weapons and all that too. And he's going to come to Kiev with all of that. And he's going to tell people in Kiev, look, I might not have got everything I was asking for, but look what I achieved. I went to Washington, I went to New York, I got all of these things. So I'm clearly the person the Americans still consider the president of Ukraine. There's no guarantee that if you remove me, anybody who might take my place, Zelensky, who is in trouble over the Nord Stream affair, Poroshenko, who is a well, maybe not a discredited figure, but at least certainly an unelected one. There's no guarantee that any of these people will be able to do as good as I have done. And in the meantime, taking steps to remove me is only going to create further instability in Kiev, which will play into the hands of the Russians. So I think that if you are looking at this issue purely in terms of Zelensky's own political position in Kiev, which at the present time I think is his most important concern, well, then he has done well out of this trip. His victory plan is a dead letter, but he remains president and will continue to be president for some time. Now, this is, in my opinion, deeply unfortunate for Ukraine, because even whilst Zelensky has managed to get the Americans to back him and has got the President of the United States to back his desire to achieve an outright win over the Russians, impossible though that actually is, even as all of that has happened, President Zelensky continues to obstruct any move towards negotiations. He is now apparently arranging for the Ukrainian delegation to the United Nations to campaign actively against what they are referring to as China's peace plan, in which the Chinese supposedly are trying to get the global south to agree to. And apparently the Ukrainians have been told to lobby the various global south countries to oppose this peace plan. It's planned for a freeze of the conflict, a ceasefire, negotiations, all of that kind of thing. Zelensky continues to adamantly refuse any kind of ceasefire, any kind of freeze of the conflict, any sort of negotiations which are not on his terms, on the basis, not based on his peace plan, which of course is a demand for Russia's capitulation. And he is now going to lobby the various countries in the global south against this. And of course, when he talks about a peace plan that's Chinese backed, he is to some extent putting all the blame on the Chinese. He's very angry apparently with them because the Chinese have now blocked exports of drones to Ukraine, with many of the FPV drones that Ukraine has been operating and the other drones apparently being essentially adapted Chinese drones which Ukraine has been importing. Anyway, he's apparently annoyed with the Chinese over this, and he's blaming the Chinese for these peace proposals, even as the actual peace plan, so far as I'm aware, is not Chinese at all, but Brazilian, with the Brazilians apparently trying to put forward this proposal, which they've been trying to sell to the countries of the global south at the United Nations. And we are told that this plan, this proposal, will be also presented to the BRICS countries by Brazil and perhaps China at the forthcoming BRICS summit meeting. And I've already said how the Russians, for their part, basically don't like this proposal. They want the war to continue because for the moment they are winning. They don't want a ceasefire that will allow the Ukrainians to recover. And from a Russian point of view, Zelensky's doing their work for them because, of course, if he rejects a ceasefire, then the Russians are under no pressure to agree to one. As I said in my program yesterday, one of the oddities about the diplomatic situation at the moment is that even as the Americans want Zelensky to remain president of Ukraine, So I suspect at some level do the Russians. Anyway, that's what Zelensky is doing. Think of what might happen if he did something else. If he said that he was prepared to take an interest in the Brazilian proposal. He still wants, or so he would say, all of the territory that Ukraine possessed pre-2014 to return to Ukraine, which is prepared to accept a ceasefire and agree to negotiations. Well, that would put a lot of pressure on the Russians in advance of the Kazan BRICS meeting. But Zelensky won't do that. And one begins to sense that this stance is losing Zelensky some friends. As I said, the Americans at the moment have chosen to go on backing him because they want a stable situation in Kiev. They don't want a crisis there, certainly during the election period. They would prefer the war to continue at least until next year, at least until after the inauguration. And that very much remains President Biden's own policy and commitment. After all, he's saying that he wants Ukraine to win the war. So the Americans want Zelensky there, and the Russians probably are not too bothered about the fact that Zelensky is there, because Zelensky's blocking negotiations which they might be under pressure to agree to, and a ceasefire they might be under pressure to agree to, if Zelensky were replaced with someone else who agreed to those things. But others, as I said, are less happy. There's been a long article today in The Spectator by the British journalist and commentator Owen Matthews. Now, Owen Matthews has been a very, very strong supporter of Ukraine, but I noticed that he too has now finally come round to the idea that there should be a ceasefire and that the Ukrainians should agree at least to the temporary occupation by the Russians of the territories that the Russians currently control. And he's trying hard in this article to present that as a Russian defeat and as a Ukrainian victory. And there's no doubt when you read the article that that is what Owen Matthews would prefer Zelensky to do. But Zelensky won't agree to this. I ought to say that reading this article by Owen Matthews does provoke certain bitter feelings. Firstly, Owen Matthews admits that the single largest grouping, the single largest number of troops fighting as part of the Russian army in the conflict zone is the 130,000 men that formerly belonged to the Donbass militia. I don't recall him ever having spoken about that before, but he admits to something which I have been saying for a very long time, that the Donbass militia, reconstituted now as part of the Russian army, reorganized, retrained, integrated into the Russian army, still forms the single largest contingent fighting in the conflict zone. When you read about Russian casualties in the conflict, inflated though Western claims about them invariably are, it is important to remember that a disproportionate part of those is actually borne by the former Donbass militia, not by the regular Russian forces that are currently being built up in Russia itself. Anyway, it would have been helpful if Owen Matthews had spoken about this more earlier, But he's now talking about Ukraine accepting de facto that the Russians will continue to occupy the territories that they control in Donbass and Crimea and other places. Of course, he has been basically opposed to that in the past. I seem to remember that he's argued against a freeze of the conflict in the past. He is now supporting a proposal whose time, in my opinion, has passed. He still seems to think that the Russians would agree to this, that, the conflict be frozen, but Ukraine pursue what he calls its European future. It doesn't seem to occur to him that after more than 2.5 years of war now, the Russians might have other ideas and might, when presented with a proposal of this kind, turn round and say no. Anyway, there we are. That's one view, Owen Matthews, and it's an opinion expressed now in Britain. I don't know how widespread this conversion, if you like, is in Britain, but I suspect that there are a lot of people in Europe, in Germany, in Italy, in France, who hanker to see the war end and would be very, very happy now if it could end on these terms, which are essentially the terms that the West sabotaged when they were almost agreed back in April 2022 in Istanbul. Anyway, let's move on. So there we go. So Zelensky remains a roadblock to negotiations, and the effect of his trip to Washington and New York, of his trip to the United States, is that he is going to remain in place, at least for the next couple of weeks or months. So more time is going to be lost, more men's lives are going to be lost. Zelensky will refuse any proposals for substantive negotiations. The conditions have never been better for the Ukrainians to mobilize an international coalition of countries that might conceivably pressure the Russians to begin talks and to agree to a ceasefire. But Zelensky is determined to prevent it. And the likelihood is, in fact, the overwhelming probability is that he will. Anyway, in the meantime, the situation on the battlefronts continues to deteriorate. And yesterday, we got further news, not just on the battlefronts, but in connection with the last weapon most recently delivered to Ukraine that we were told was going to be the game changer, and that is the F-16s. The Russians carried out a major missile strike on the airbase in Ukraine at Starokonstantinov. And this missile strike was carried out by hypersonic Kinzhal missiles. Now, these missiles can penetrate Ukrainian air defenses, and they can also, they have the kinetic energy to break through hardened air shelters, such as do exist at Starokonstantinov. And well, we're getting lots of reports about what this missile strike was all about. And the reports say that the Russians had detected the presence of F-16s at Starokonstantinov, that they targeted the shelters at which these aircraft, these F-16s, were housed, that 2 of them were damaged or perhaps destroyed. Other reports say 4, that a Sukhoi 24, Soviet-era Sukhoi 24, bomber adapted to launch Storm Shadow missiles was damaged or destroyed also, and supposedly a warehouse where Storm Shadow missiles were housed was also destroyed as well. Now, none of this, of course, is confirmed. I don't know for a fact that any aircraft were damaged or destroyed in this strike at all. But anyway, that's what the reports say. If they're true, and quite plausibly they are, then there's been another major setback for the Ukrainians. More of their precious F-16s have been lost, and their ability to conduct missile strikes with Storm Shadows have been reduced further. Whilst on the subject of Ukrainian airstrikes, the United States has announced that it is preparing to provide Ukraine with precision-guided gliding bombs, similar to the ones that are used by the Russians. Some are seeing this as an American decision to provide bombs instead of missiles. The bombs supposedly could be used beyond the Russian border. But of course, they lack the range to do the kind of things that the Storm Shadows and the ATACMS and the others might plausibly do. And as I've discussed already, bringing Ukrainian aircraft so close to the Russian border that they could launch those bombs in that kind of location would be to place those aircraft at extreme risk and guarantee that large numbers of them, if they were to continue to do this, would be shot down. So anyway, I think that this is another example of the United States making the best that it can, providing Ukraine with bombs instead of missiles. The United States looks increasingly reluctant to provide more missiles. So instead of providing missiles, they're providing bombs instead. And rather than being an escalation, the fact that the decision has been made to provide these bombs, it should be seen, in fact, as evidence that America's ability to continue to supply Ukraine with weapons is starting to reduce. By the way, there's been another article in the London Times which also says that in the case of Britain has basically exhausted its ability to supply Ukraine with weapons, and that Ukraine should not expect further significant weapons deliveries from Britain. Which, of course, brings me to the further point, which is that all these ideas about freezes of the conflict, negotiations, ceasefires that we see being written in the West. I read a long article. It was sent to me again by, or rather, the link was sent to me, provided to me by the historian Jeff Roberts. A long article discussing why it is proving so difficult for Russia and Ukraine to sit down and negotiate. And it made some interesting points. But it continued to fall for the fallacy that there is some kind of stalemate situation on the battlefronts, that Ukraine is suffering terrible losses, it is being exhausted, it's all of those things, but that the Russians have also suffered terrible losses, and they're only making minor incremental advances, and that though the Kremlin supposedly is happy to keep the war going all but indefinitely, the Russian public might prefer to see the war ended reasonably soon rather than have it extended forever. But the war is not going to be extended forever because Ukraine is losing. The attrition that Ukraine has been experiencing for almost 3 years now is taking a terrible toll on Ukraine. As the American journalist David Ignatius recently pointed out in the Washington Post, Ukraine is bleeding out. The Russians are not bleeding out. They're getting stronger. The Russians are making significant progress on the battlefronts, much more significant, I think, than a lot of commentators in the West understand. And they feel that they are winning, even as Ukraine is clearly losing. And if the Russians at the moment are less keen on negotiations, that is why. You don't have to analyze the Russian position to the extent that this article does. The explanation for Russian reluctance to engage Ukraine in negotiations presents itself the moment you understand that, in fact, the Russians are winning and know that they are. And on the subject of negotiations, I might just quickly add that the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, who is also currently in New York, has had a meeting with the UN Secretary General, Mr. Guterres, and he has warned Mr. Guterres that the United Nations should not let itself get drawn into what Lavrov said was pseudo-peace proposals floated by the Ukrainians. Such proposals would not fly and would certainly fail. And if the UN Secretariat got drawn into appearing to support those proposals, they would compromise, in Russian eyes, their own position, which depends on neutrality and maintaining equidistance between the various sides. So we can see that the Russians, confident in the fact that they are winning, do not feel under the same sort of pressure to begin negotiations that some people in the West would like to believe. These, by the way, just to add as well, a lot of these assumptions, and I made this point before, a lot of these assumptions about a supposed Russian readiness to begin negotiations is based on exaggerated estimates of Russian losses, which I am convinced do not correspond with realities. Well, that then leads us to the actual situation on the front lines, and the big battle, at least the battle that's attracting all the attention, is the battle for Vuhledar. And over the last 24 hours, the Russians have made significant further progress within Vuhledar itself. At least this is according to the various reporting and mapping projects. I haven't seen much in the way of film and photographic evidence of where the Russians exactly are in Vuhledar. But I have seen pictures of, well, the bombing of Vuhledar in area, a relatively small place, and it makes a terrifying spectacle. I mean, you see flashes and smoke and explosions in the Ukrainian-controlled part of Vuhledar. And as I said in my program yesterday, one has to worry about the fate of any Ukrainian soldiers who find themselves being buried beneath all of that. But anyway, the various reporting and mapping projects show that more areas of Vuhledar over the last 24 hours have passed under Russian control, or at least have been occupied by the Russians. I said yesterday that it seemed to me that perhaps a quarter of Vuhledar is now in effect controlled by the Russian army. Based on the maps that I have seen, and to repeat again, I'm not the best person to read maps, but based on what I have seen, I reckon the Russians now control between 40 and 50% of the metropolitan area of Vuhledar. And the Russians are also making claims that they have the Ukrainians in effect surrounded. There's a report in the TASS news agency which claims that the Russians rather, have cut all the roads leading into Vuhledar, that they have either occupied the actual roads or they have fire control over all of the roads. And I think this is true, by the way. I have absolutely no doubt that it is. It looks like the 72nd Brigade of the Ukrainian army, which is fighting in Vuhledar, is going to be destroyed. I don't really see any other outcome. I hope the men of that brigade make the wise and correct decision to surrender and save their lives, because I can see no other way out for them. I think that if they go on fighting, they're dying in a hopeless cause. And, well, it's likely that, as I said, to all intents and purposes, Vuhledar will have passed fully under Russian control within the next couple of hours. Now, I say that almost certainly it will take several days before the Russians announce the capture of Vuhledar once it has, properly speaking, fallen, because it's likely that there are large numbers of Ukrainian troops still hiding in parts of Vuhledar. The Russians have a tendency to do this sort of thing. The Russian Defense Ministry, for example, today published confirmation that the village of Marinovka, located close to Selidovo, has now been captured by the Russian army. In my opinion, Marinovka has been under Russian control for some time. The fact that the Russian Defense Ministry delayed announcing that fact led to all kinds of speculations and claims, including by the Ukrainians, that they were still in control of this village. But what I think actually happens is that the Russians capture a place and then they spend several days or weeks sometimes clearing the village or town, looking for any Ukrainian soldiers who are still hiding in the ruins or the basements, taking them prisoner or killing them, clearing all the mines and explosives and booby traps with which these places are littered. And only once this clearing operation has been fully completed does the Russian Defense Ministry announce that a particular location has passed fully under Russian control. So even if Ukrainian resistance in Vuhledar collapses, it's likely that it will take some time before the Russian Defense Ministry confirms this fact. Just saying. So anyway, Vuhledar is turning into a grisly, gruesome disaster for the Ukrainian army. One of Ukraine's best brigades, the 72nd Brigade, has been needlessly sacrificed in the defense of this fortified town. But the news elsewhere for Ukraine continues to be very bad. as I said, Marinovka, Russian Defense Ministry has confirmed, has fallen. The Russians are claiming, I read the report today in TASS, that a group of Ukrainian troops have been surrounded close to the village of Tsukurinye, south of Selidovo, and west of Ukrainsk. Reports like this, when they appear in TASS, tend to be, I think, pretty reliable. It suggests that Tsukurinye is about to fall and that the Russians are going to capture this village within the next couple of days or so. The Russians are said to have gained control of more railway lines in the area south of Selidovo. And if you look at a map, as I discussed recently, Selidovo looks encircled on three sides. The Ukrainians can still access Selidovo from the west, but it's hardly likely that they will be able to hold on to Selidovo for very long. And elsewhere, apparently, there's now further confirmation today that the Russians are in complete control of Nikolaevka, the village immediately south of Mirnograd, and that they're clearing the various fortifications, essentially trenches, that the Ukrainians hurriedly dug south of Mirnograd over the last couple of days. These fortified positions, to the extent that they're really fortified, have fallen under Russian control, or are falling under Russian control very fast. And there's now suggestions that the Russians are going to try to enter Mirnograd itself before the autumn rains, the October rains, before the Rasputitsa starts, and in other words, street fighting in Mirnograd and Pokrovsk could begin within the next couple of days. Well, as to that, we'll just have to wait and see. So anyway, that's the situation in the critically important Pokrovsk, Vuhledar area. The situation is deteriorating rapidly, and apparently it's getting worse in other places as well. Now, yesterday, the military summary channel made a radical, I would say exactly a claim, because they didn't definitely say that this was the case, but they suggested that based on a Ukrainian video about a Ukrainian police unit, which has now become a paramilitary unit, part of the Ukrainian military, their recapture of a building in Toretsk, in an area which the Ukrainians always claimed, which all the mapping projects always claimed that the Ukrainians control. Anyway, based on the fact that this video effectively confirmed that the Russians had advanced much deeper into Toretsk than had been conceded by the various mapping projects, a point which I have made many times. They guessed or suggested that Toretsk, the entire area of Toretsk, the whole town and the coal mines and all the fortified positions there, have actually already completely passed under Russian control. Now, I have to say, I do not go that far. It's unusual for me. Usually, I am prepared to put the Russians further forward than the military summary channel does. It's unusual for me to see the military summary channel make a suggestion as radical as this. They're usually very rigorous, I have to say, relying heavily on geolocations based on film and photographic evidence before they actually say where the Russians are in any location. Anyway, I don't go this far. I think that fighting is still going on in Donetsk, and there's still some way to go here. But I read today that the Russians are now control around 40% of the high-rise building area in Donetsk. It looks as if the Russians are continuing to advance in Donetsk. And if you look at a map and look at where this high-rise building area is, you can see how control of it would put in question Ukrainian control of Donetsk, and it would also explain why the coal mining area, the coal mine where the Ukrainians recently demolished that building, why the Ukrainians might have concluded that with the Russians advancing in this adjoining high-rise area, the coal mine itself was about to fall. By the way, the Military Summary channel did make a particular valid point about this particular video, which is that it showed what looked to be one of the structures, the specific structure which the Ukrainians have just destroyed. It showed that structure still intact, which suggests that that video is actually quite old. It was clearly made before this structure had been destroyed, which suggests that the Russians have presumably advanced significantly beyond that building, which that video showed the Ukrainians recapturing. In other words, it was an episode which has already passed us by. Anyway, let's press forward. There's less news from Seversk, from Chasiv Yar. The Russians, group of forces north, admits that they have pulled back from the aggregate plant area in Volchansk, but contrary to some claims, they still seem to be intent on capturing Volchansk, because they say that in the high-rise building area in Volchansk, they've just captured another building. That was their latest report. There's some claims also that the group of forces north are attempting to capture the village of Tiche, which is located to the northeast of Volchansk itself. So fighting clearly continues there. There's less news from the Kursk direction at the moment, but ultimately the overall picture from this war is the same. The Russians are about to capture, or perhaps have already captured, Vuhledar. Kurakhovo, the next important town to the north, looks as if it is now in serious peril of being encircled. If Tsukurinye and Girnik fall, I forgot to mention, by the way, that there is now photographs, apparently, which show Russian troops raising their flag in the north of Girnik, which suggests that the Russians are already in control of at least a significant part of Girnik, though perhaps not all of it. With Girnik and presumably about to fall, with Tsukurinye about to fall, with Selidovo likely to fall fairly soon, any Ukrainian troops are remaining, holding out in Kurakhovo after Vuhledar falls, with the Russians located in positions immediately to the west of Kurakhovo. I saw a report, again I think it was in TASS, which said that the Russians have now taken positions 2 kilometers to the west of Kurakhovo. Well, it was in Rydovka, actually. Well, Kurakhovo, at serious risk of being encircled. The Ukrainian troops there likely to be encircled. The Ukrainian defenses in this whole area of Western Donbass fragmenting, and with the Russians apparently about to enter Mirnograd, and with good questions about how deeply the Russians have penetrated into Toretsk, but with all the indications are being that the Russians are pushing forward hard in Toretsk, and with further indications that the Russians are breaking through in Chasiv Yar, and they've already established positions west of the Zherebets River, and they're clearing up on the Oskol River, and they're talking apparently a senior Russian officer. I haven't seen this. I've just seen reports about this, but a senior Russian officer is now talking about the Russians preparing to encircle the Ukrainian forces in Kursk region. This presumably resulting from the capture of the villages of Plekhovo and Sverdlikovo, south of Sudzha, with the Russians apparently now in the process of storming Plekhovo and having reached, it seems, the outskirts of Sverdlikovo. Well, one way or the other, the direction of travel, as we can see across the contact line, is very clear. Ukrainian losses continue to be at appalling levels, and the Russians are now able to conduct missile strikes and drop bombs. They're bombing Zaporozhye with glided bombs. They're able to reach that far. They're sending drones, Orion drones, to launch missiles in Nikopol, places that were previously beyond their reach. Well, it's clear, it ought to be obvious now, that Ukraine is losing the war. And these diplomatic maneuvers at the United Nations are prolonging a war which is already lost. And the effect of the talks in Washington appears to have been to secure the position of President Zelensky, which further guarantees that the war will be completely lost. It all seems extraordinary, an incredible waste of life, and of course the likely destruction of the Ukraine we have known, which, for all its many problems, was a home of a sort for millions of people who lived there. An unnecessary war. It could have been avoided. Peace could have been found at many points in time. That peace has been delayed, and we've been brought to this point, and even now, diplomacy is failing. Well, there it is. We'll see what the next stages are in the war. I suspect that diplomacy is now going to take a backseat. We'll see what this meeting of Western leaders comes up with on the 12th of October. Putin has given a long speech about energy policy in Moscow, attended, by the way, by a delegation from Afghanistan. The Afghan government have sent a delegation to participate in it, which is interesting. Apparently, Afghanistan making steps to join the BRICS as well, just saying. Over the course of it, he talked about the fact that payment and currency and messaging systems are being perfected. And he also spoke again about Russian economic growth. All of that taking place. And in the meantime, Ukraine is being led further to defeat and perhaps its eventual destruction. Led further along that primrose path that Professor Mearsheimer spoke about in that prophetic lecture he gave back in 2015, 9 years ago. Anyway, there we are. That's all I'm going to say today. That finishes my program for today. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. And don't forget, if you've liked this program, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.